As we were hearing in the news there, Russian missiles have hit major Ukrainian cities, including the capital Kyiv, killing at least 10 people and injuring 60 more. Air raid sirens are actually going off in the capital Kyiv as we speak.
Russia has fired 83 missiles at civilian targets across Ukraine, and it's just been reported that one of the missiles hit the German consulate visa office in Ukraine, but it was not in use when it struck.
Well, NATO's chief Jens Stoltenberg has condemned Russia's horrific and indiscriminate attacks in Ukraine, as he called them. Meanwhile, China is also calling now for de-escalation.
The attacks have come after the only bridge that connects Russia to Crimea partially exploded on Saturday morning. Ukraine has not so far admitted any responsibility for the explosion.
Well, President Putin was speaking earlier, confirming those strikes and saying there will be a harsh response to any further attacks on what he called Russian territory. And the leader of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, has stated too that Belarus and Russia are now to form a joint military group, saying that his country was under threat from NATO, but without giving any further details.
Let's take a look at where some of the explosions have hit in Ukraine now. As you can see, some of the cities that have been hit include Ternopil and Lviv in the west of Ukraine, and Dnipro, which is in the south of Ukraine. There have also been missile strikes in the capital, Kyiv.
Let's speak now to Keir Giles, who's a senior consulting fellow for the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us, Keir. As we were saying, I gather that the alarms, the air raid sirens are going off in Kyiv once more. This does appear to be Russia returning to a previous tactic of using these long-range missiles to hit civilian areas.
That's right. That tactic never really went away. Russia has always been trying to hammer civilian areas in Ukraine, but it hasn't been seen at this kind of intensity since the early weeks of the war. And it does seem to be a deliberate response by Russia to try to destroy what it can. This seems to be the attitude that if they can't defeat Ukraine by military means, if they can't have Ukraine, nobody else can. So they will be trying to cause as much destruction and misery across the country as they're able to. And there are two separate programs here. There are two separate patterns of attacks. We're seeing a lot of pictures and video of attacks in populated areas in the cities because that's where people are. But the other thing that's happening at the same time is targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, trying to make sure that Ukraine doesn't have power. And we're already hearing about the start of rolling blackouts of power in major populated areas as a result.
Our Prime Minister, Liz Truss, will meet with fellow leaders of the G7 tomorrow. They'll have crisis talks on the situation in Ukraine. What needs to come out to emerge from those talks?
Well, first of all, we're already hearing a lot of messages from around the world condemning these Russian attacks quite rightly. What we're not hearing so much of is additional help to Ukraine to actually defend itself against these genocidal assaults from Russia. Ukraine's been asking for a long time for advanced air defenses so that it can protect its cities against missile attacks like this. And for all the gratitude that Ukraine has been showing so far, they're also pointing out that that hasn't been received, and that leaves civilians, ordinary people, men, women and children across Ukraine vulnerable to this kind of indiscriminate attack.
And would that be a major calculation for all powers, in that obviously if you do start putting more aircraft into the sky, you try and hit the site of the missiles being fired, you could actually encroach on Russian territory proper, and that obviously then changes all the various calculations that Putin would make himself?
Well, nobody is yet talking publicly about that kind of strike against Russia's own assets by aircraft that aren't Ukrainians. What they're asking for instead is air defenses. It's something that can actually protect against the missiles that are coming in, against all of the rocket attacks that we've seen since the very early stages of this conflict. Now, we did, at the very early time of this war, hear calls for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, where Western allies and partners of Ukraine would be able to protect its airspace. That, I think, we'll hear more of again, trying to defend those Ukrainian populated areas against Russia.
And the attacks that we're seeing, that we're discussing now, they are in response to the attack on the Crimea bridge. Just tell us why this is such an important bridge for President Putin.
Well, first of all, it's worth mentioning that Putin has not only pointed to the attack on the Kerch Bridge to Crimea as a cause for this stepping up the attacks on civilians in Ukraine. He's also saying that Ukraine's been carrying out a number of other attacks, some of which seem quite implausible, like bombing the gas pipeline to Turkey and carrying out an attack on a Russian nuclear power station. But in any case, yes, we were expecting that there would be some kind of response, and we were waiting to see what it was after Ukraine struck at this highly symbolic target, which not only has a military impact on Russia being able to deliver troops and equipment to Crimea, but also strikes at the symbolic nature of Russia's seizure of Crimea. This was the great Russian triumph, where it connected Crimea to the Russian mainland. And striking at that, of course, sends a message across Russia.
And what will that humiliation be doing for Putin's position? He's been speaking today in St. Petersburg, but we do understand that there are increasing voices in the Kremlin questioning this whole approach.
That's right. The criticism of President Putin has been becoming even more vocal, and the criticism of his generals and the conduct of the war has now become really quite shrill. Putin did have to respond with some show of force, because otherwise it would be a demonstration of weakness and an admission of defeat in this war. The problem for Putin, of course, is that the reality gap between how this war has been sold to the Russian population and the evidence that they cannot deny is getting wider and wider all the time. And that, of course, puts a lot of strain on how Putin can manage this war.
Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow, Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. It's a long title. Thank you very much indeed for your expertise and wisdom. Thank you.
Important title. Thank you very much indeed.